Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about Magician by Raymond E Feist. This was one of the books that when I was a young fantasy reader, and I'm fairly sure I've mentioned it before at least a few times, but this was one of the books that really captured my imagination when I was younger. It really inspired me in terms of fantasy and big, chunky, epic fantasy volumes that obviously ended up consuming my life. But there were other aspects of it that, even at the time I was reading it, even when I was younger, that I went, that sticks out, or that's different. I want to know more about it. I want to know why. And I'm going to talk about those aspects in a minute. But what I'm going to talk about first is the appeal of the familiar. When I read Magician, I had already read The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. Actually, I'd read The Lord of the Rings first and then read The Hobbit, and actually was disappointed in The Hobbit because it wasn't as grand and epic as The Lord of the Rings. I'm sure if I'd encountered it the other way around, I'd have been much happier with The Hobbit. But I have never been as fond of The Hobbit as I am of The Lord of the Rings for that simple reason. The first Tolkien book that I read was The Fellowship of the Ring. And because of that, that established in my head what this world was, the tone of the world, the style of the world, what I loved about it. And then reading The Hobbit was kind of a step down because it was clearly more focused at children. Still very well written, still exquisitely crafted, but it wasn't what I wanted. And then I found a bunch of other fantasy books, which I am sure at some point I'll talk about. But one of the big ones was Magician by Raymond E Feist. And this was the UK edition. And Magician by Raymond E Feist in the States was published as a duology, Magician, Apprentice, Magician, Master. But in the UK, the first edition, which had a very pale blue color and a tiny figure riding a horse with a giant fantasy castle in the background. I must see if I can actually find. I have had about 4 copies of that book. Never lend books to people. You know what my thing is now that I do? If I lend you a book, I take a picture of you holding the book. And then when I go, where's that book? I can look through the folder of who has various books that I've lent out. Go, them. And you can message them and go, you still have my book? And they go, no, 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 I don't. And you can send them the picture, go, I have evidence of you taking it. But that's because I'm now paranoid and I've had to repurchase books over and over again. Anyway, back to Magician. So with Magician, one of the things that I really loved about it was this, what we now call a pseudo-medieval world. Now, today, people use that very much in the pejorative because they go, oh, it's cliched, oh, it's the standard, and oh, it's boring, and blah, blah, blah. For a start, it's only cliche and boring if you've read lots of them. When you haven't read that many of them, it's still exciting. So that's a point to consider. Secondly, when this came out, it wasn't the absolute standard everywhere. This is still an early epic fantasy that is exploring and playing with this style. And it is very much in that Tolkienian vein. So there was a level of familiarity about the approach to the world that I recognized. Although it was not a direct analog, I could recognize the sort of the British Isles nature of things, that Western European view of the world. And it had been tweaked slightly. And of course, part of that was because Raymond E Feist is an American, and therefore, yeah, of course he tweaked it. So the world that we encounter with the Kingdom of the Isles on Midkemia, that was familiar enough that it was recognizable. I didn't feel at sea. But it was different enough that it was enjoyable. It was new. It was something exciting. There were men and dwarves and elves, all of the things I knew from Tolkien, but they weren't carbon copies of Tolkien. And of course, that is that blend of the familiar and the new. It was something that was both comforting as well as exciting. Really great blend. In terms of the style with which Feist had written it, it didn't have the depth or the richness of Tolkien's language. It was slightly more straightforward, I suppose we could say. Much more straightforward style of prose. It was delivered in a more direct fashion. there was more of an emphasis on action, not necessarily combat, but on action. The dialogue was more modern. And because of all of these things, for mini AP, young AP, this was a much more accessible text. And that was exciting and wonderful. I didn't have to look up quite so many words as I did when I was reading Tolkien, which has both its benefits and its drawbacks. One of the joys I get from reading is the exploration of what the English language can do. And Tolkien stretched my knowledge of English. Feist's novel was comfortably within my range. And that made it, in some regards, a more enjoyable read, but less fulfilling. So again, it's all about this balance between these different tensions about the aspects that we want to get out of reading. Now, added to that, if we think of who Tolkien's heroes were in The Lord of the Rings, a lot of the focus is obviously on Frodo. Frodo was never a character that I, as a child, identified with. And, you know, this is something we talk about a lot, that I couldn't really see myself in Frodo. I couldn't really imagine myself on that quest. That it was more, I was watching them on a quest and their story was exciting and I was enjoying it. On the other hand, Feist did something that is perhaps we could talk about in relation to the gaming aspect, where a lot of his initial ideas in the world came from. But in Feist's Magician, there are three young male characters that each have their own distinct character arcs, going on their own distinct journeys. Pug on the mage's journey, Tomas on the warrior's journey, Arutha on the politician and ruler's journey. So we saw those three arcs being developed, each of these not stereotypical, archetypical, masculine or male focused or male centric power fantasies, magic, martial, ruling caste. And you go, right. So I can understand, or at least this was part of the appeal to me, that when I was that young, seeing this was a way to live through those fantasies. I was putting more of myself into the text and taking on more of their journeys as if I was inhabiting the character. And that is a deeply immersive technique. It's wonderful. I identified with Pug and Tomas and Arutha far more than I did with Frodo and Sam, Merry and Pippin, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli. That I didn't identify with them. I thought, you know, Legolas was a cool archer. Gimli was a bit lame. He got done a bit dirty, but at least not as bad as Jackson treated him. Aragorn was the character that I really looked up to. The hobbits, well, they were there. Gandalf, oh, that was awesome, but you know, he was the wise mentor figure. So you could see there was a lot of distance between me as a child reading The Lord of the Rings and the characters. But in this instance, Pug being not the most popular guy in the castle, not the one that's picked first for all of the sports teams, good at reading, he's smart, he's he becomes well educated, he thinks his way out of problems rather than punching his way out of problems. And this is a character in a book. I wonder why young AP was so invested in Pug's story. And then Tomas, the blonde, blue-eyed, attractive, athletic, everyone looked up to. Oh, he's awesome. He was your best friend. He was someone you wanted to emulate. Pug was someone you identified with. Tomas was someone I wanted to emulate and be like and be that popular and be that awesome and be that athletic. So you could see the attraction, these hooks that were being set in my mind as a reader reading this book. And then Arutha, the slightly taciturn, surly, well-educated, smarter than the people next to him. And that initial impression of him being slightly arrogant, thinking he's slightly better than everyone else. I have to admit it, as a kid, I was sometimes that arrogant idiot who forgot that you are almost always not the smartest person in the room. That was a lesson I had to learn in my life. And it was a very important lesson. It's something that Arutha has to learn over the course of this study, over the course of this novel. And of course, if only I'd paid more attention to the text back then, I might have saved myself some very embarrassing situations in my life. But that was a very important lesson for me to learn in my life, that I wasn't the smartest person in the room. I might have specialisms, I might have education and experience, but that has nothing to do with intelligence. And these are all things that get explored in this book. The fact that you can have power, you can have specialisms, but when it comes to something outside your realm of expertise, someone else is going to be the expert. And you have to rely on them, you have to work together. And so there was this wonderful aspect of this story that really engaged me, that engaged in all of the different aspects that baby me really wanted and wanted to experience. So that was one of the reasons why I really loved this book. But one of the things that I was really interested in was the structure of the novel. When we were reading Tolkien, the chapters flowed pretty much chronologically until we get to that break, and it's, oh, and now the fellowship is sundered and half go this way and half go that way. You know, the story starts splintering, and then we read a chunk in one section, and then we go to the next section, and it's now that story, and it skips back in time, and we have this sort of disjointed, asynchronous narrative because that's how Tolkien divided it up. What Feist did was the movement between stories, this movement between them. Part of Pug's story and concentrating on that, and then going on and looking at Tomas's story while Pug was, doing something boring. Let's go and have a look at what Tomas is doing. Tomas is doing something interesting. Well, now Tomas is doing something boring. Let's go and see what Arutha is doing. This movement between storylines. Now, this is not, groundbreaking or innovative, but for me at that stage, I hadn't seen it done quite like this. So this really engaged me. These three storylines, with Pug being the major focus, and then both Tomas and Arutha forming the sort of two minor focuses, but it's a tripartite storyline. And then there was a break in the middle, much like we have in Tolkien, where we have that separation, and there was a time jump. Because, yeah, stuff happened here, but it's not enough of the big things. Big things happen, things develop, but a lot of the narrative ground to a halt. So we're just going to skip it. We're going to skip the boring bit. And we're just going to move on to the next interesting bit. Because that accelerated time, that time jump, means that suddenly now the characters are growing up. And we didn't have to struggle through every single lesson that they learned. And it allowed the characters to suddenly leap up and evolve in terms of power and ability and responsibility. And that, again, was something I quite enjoyed. So ultimately, the structure of how Feist had put this novel together, and obviously looking at it now, that time jump happens exactly where the break between the two volumes in the American edition are. But reading the UK edition, I was unaware of that because it wasn't the 20th or the 25th anniversary edition. It was the first, I think it was the first UK edition. Or at least the first UK paperback. I don't think I could afford hardbacks back then. So this was new to me. And that was exciting, knowing that you could do things like this, that you could weave stories together. So that was something that inspired me and has kept with me about thinking about the structure of stories. Why break away from that storyline at that point to tell this one? Starting to ask those questions even back then. So now we want to move on to another aspect of this book that may seem like a negative criticism of it. But at the time, it was something that intrigued me, something that was just scratching at the back of my brain when I was reading. And that was the politics of the characters versus the cultural view of the characters versus the cultural view of the world. The Kingdom of the Isles is heavily patriarchal. A woman cannot inherit the throne. Princess Caroline will never inherit Crede. That the line of succession goes to the eldest son, not the eldest child. This is a very patriarchal world. And yet, anytime one of the good characters espouses anything close to that, one of the other good characters goes, "Oh, how can you believe that?" Because one of the things that Feist did was he imbued the male characters with an appreciation and voice for feminism, for equality between men and women. And yet that is in direct opposition to the entirety of the world building. It is very much the view of the audience being put into these characters' heads so that these characters resonate more with the reader than they do with their world. And it creates this very interesting dynamic because one of the characters who is in this volume, a bad guy, he's a bad guy, and he goes, "Oh, yes, I was doing that." And he treats female characters as pawns, as property, as things to be traded. And yet, all of the male characters who are good think that this is despicable. And you have this very strange contrast and juxtaposition of a very modern view of treating everyone equally, even in a feudal society that has a patriarchal base norm, but treat everyone equally if you want to be thought of as good, but never challenge your society's position. So even as a child reading this, I was struck by it's really weird that all the good guys treat women equally, but their entire world is set up to say that no, that's not the case. It it really confused me, and it got me interested in that reader dynamic about how often we judge characters based on our current cultural, moral, ethical positions. And we map those onto a character and we judge that character on there. Are they good or bad according to my views now, today, this sort of presentism, instead of thinking about whether or not that character fits within their world. And it was that contrast between the views of the world, the views of the societies in this world, the views of the characters within those world, and the views of the reader reading the text. And I didn't have the vocabulary back then or the concepts back then to really articulate and dig into and examine this aspect of the reading experience and how meaning is constructed and how authors manipulate readers' emotions, responses, and feelings. But I noticed it, and it was something that I wanted to know more about. If you read these books now, and there is a giant Riftwar Saga, because I think it started out the Riftwar trilogy, then it became like the Riftwar Cycle, and then like the Riftwar Saga, and then it became, do you have an entire bookcase? Because we're now going to fill it up with these books. And those aren't the only ones that he ever wrote. But this is an example of sort of classic fantasy now, of that style, that movement that we saw with the transition from Tolkien into Terry Brooks, Robert Jordan, Raymond E Feist, all of these authors who took what Tolkien did and modernized it. And in particular with Raymond E Feist, taking in some of the sensibility, some of the sequences, some of the adventure that you get from role play games, where you get from party formation and having clear set roles and archetypes and positions within a text and specialist sets of skills for characters. And even like the follow-up book, Silverthorn, was very much about the formation of a quest group where certain people have certain skills. And you go, oh, right. But modernizing the language, modernizing the action, focusing more on a cultural sensibility that the readers perhaps resonated more with than something that felt too archaic. And so it was a fascinating novel on my journey to end up the person that I did. So in part, I blame Raymond E Feist for who I ended up as. Like he bears part of the blame for me setting up this YouTube channel. And what was even more wonderful about this was the follow-up novels, the Servant of the Empire, or sorry, Daughter of the Empire, Servant of the Empire, Mistress of the Empire, the trilogy co-written with Johnny Wirtz, and it introduced me to Wirtz's writing. It introduced me to a new way to look at the world, to a new way to look at what epic fantasy could do, and a new way to approach storytelling. And I'll probably do a more built-out video on that one at another point. But I wanted to talk about Magician by Raymond E Feist because it was one of those texts that really spoke to me when I was a wee lad. And it was one of those books that blended the familiar with the new. And it's one of those books that now, after all of the developments in the genre, it does show its age in places because the genre has evolved. It has moved on. It has refined some of the techniques that were still being played with, still being formed when Feist was using them. And so it's part of that exploration of the genre to see where things came from, to see how they have evolved. Because if you go back and look at it now, you can look at it as, well, I'm going to read it as if it was made today. And if you do, it might end up being disappointing. But if you look at it as an artifact of its time, of being part of this evolution of the genre, it becomes even more fascinating. Anyway, those were just my thoughts on Magician by Raymond E Feist. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.